I've mentioned before, as we're making our way through now the story of Jacob on our long journey through the book of Genesis, I've mentioned before that there's some tension among scholars in trying to answer this question: how much moral blameworthiness can we lay at the feet of Jacob? There's an inclination for us to see him as gentle because he's not like his brother Esau, and that may make us inclined to try to give him the benefit of the doubt. Others on the other side of the battle are aghast and appalled at his trickery and his almost con man status. I don't know that I want to take a strong stand one way or the other. I want to recognize that both sides have some support. But one of the things that pushes me, maybe wrongly, I may be guilty of being like Job's friends here, but one of the things that pushes me in the direction of embracing a view that Jacob had plenty wrong with him is the hardships that he had to deal with in dealing first with Laban and then later on with the result of that hardship. As we come now to Genesis chapter 30, we have a couple of interesting accounts, important elements of the life of Jacob, both of which don't necessarily show him doing wrong, but do seem to present him sort of reaping the whirlwind after what he's sown. That's why I say I don't want to be like Job's friends and say, well, look, in this chapter, here's Jacob having a hard time. It must mean he's a bad guy. Certainly not. But the fact that he's not only going through this hard time, but that it's all wrapped up in his own earlier failures, gives some weight to the idea that Jacob is sort of getting his just deserts to some degree. Well, what do I mean by that? Well, first thing that happens here, of course, is remembering that it was Jacob's intent and desire to marry Rachel. Laban and Leah pull the surprise and bring Leah to him without him knowing it after 7 years of working. And then after the marriage to Leah, Rachel is allowed to marry Jacob, and now he's got two wives. And, that's not always a good thing. It's not the way God designed things. And you can see that in this chapter and in this particular story, because what we see going on here is almost like a maternal arms race, if you will. Those of you old enough to remember the Cold War will remember that, the United States or Western Europe put out this kind of missile on this kind of spot, and then the Soviet bloc put that kind of missile on the other spot, and then we had to upgrade ours, and they had to upgrade theirs, and we had to upgrade our missile defense. This is called the arms race. Well, you got a baby race going on here. Leah, who was less loved at the beginning of this relationship with Jacob than Rachel was, is given the blessing of more children, while Rachel seems to be unable to give any children. And Rachel, who was supposed to be the one, that is the love of Jacob's life, is like Sarah before her, frustrated at this reality, and so pulls a Sarah and Hagar on Jacob, says, here, take my maid, marry her, and give me child through her. And lo and behold, the maid does become pregnant. Leah fires back and says, no, take my maid. And they're all just counting these sons, or watching these sons being born, knowing they're going to become the essentially the patriarchs of the 12 tribes. But Jacob is in the middle of this. And in a way that's really not too terribly pleasant. Let me ask you this question. Have you ever read something in Scripture where you think to yourself, now I know I've read that before because I know I've read the whole Bible, but I don't remember that at all. There's a story here in Genesis chapter 30 that you don't hear very many sermons on. You don't hear much conversation on. And yet it is really, depending on how you want to frame it, interesting or just flat out weird. We get the context of this battle between Rachel and Leah. Who's going to give him more sons? Who's going to give him more maids to have more sons? There's the back and forth going on. And into this account, we have one of Leah's sons bringing back from his work a mandrake. Now, I have to confess that everything I know about mandrakes I learned watching a Harry Potter movie once. I don't know much about them at all. I'm sure that whatever I saw there on Harry Potter was a little bit more fanciful than the reality, but we can tell by the context in this story that these mandrakes were, what's the word for it? A delicacy. They were prized. And Rachel goes to Leah and says, hey, let me have one of these mandrakes. And Leah is like, golly, Neds, you just never give up, do you? First you take my husband away, and then you're trying to take my mandrakes away. Well, Rachel's not necessarily willing and ready to embrace that summary of their relationship, but she does realize that she does have a bargaining chip in this dispute, and she offers it up to Leah. She says, look, here's what I'm going to do for you. You're upset that I've taken away your husband. You don't want to give me your mandrakes. I'll tell you what, I'll settle for the mandrakes. That is, if you just give me a mandrake right now, I will send our husband to you tonight. You see, that's the kind of story you think I would never forget if I ever read that. But I have. That is a bizarre story. I want you to, again, put yourself in Jacob's shoes. You have now 4 wives. You are still living under the thumb of Laban. You're out working and busting your hump and trying to provide for your family. And you come home, and there's Leah, the one you didn't necessarily want to marry, but the one who's giving you a lot of children. And she says, oh, by the way, I know you just got home from work, but I happen to trade a mandrake for you. I gave Rachel a mandrake, and she gave me you for the night in return. I mean, can you? It's a one. No, I mean, if I were given to being a hardcore feminist, I wouldn't plant my flag on Deborah as the place where we see the triumph of women. I think it's this place. Here's Jacob being treated like a sire, like a stud horse. It appears there's nothing he can do. And Jacob doesn't say, I'll sleep with whoever I want to sleep. He's like, oh, yes, ma'am. He is a profoundly henpecked man. And this is just a shocking story. Do you see, though? But again, what I want you to see, we talked about how God makes straight lines with crooked sticks. We talked about how whether you discern that Rebekah and Jacob were wrong in deceiving Isaac, or whether Isaac was wrong in having the kind of attitude that made it seem like he was going to need to be deceived for God's plan to come to pass. You don't have to decide whether they should have done that. I have the view that they should not have done what they did, but God works through that, and I sort of look at it like what we're getting an in behind the curtain look. We're seeing how the sausage is made in this account of how the kingdom is going to be coming. Well, having seen all that, now we see the fruit of this. Now we see the mess that's been made, a mess made by Laban. And Laban has the same kind of sneaky, conniving, plotting perspective that Jacob has. And just like there's tension between Jacob and Esau, now there's tension between Leah and Rachel. And then again, like the Cold War, these maids are like the surrogate satellite nations, like, us waging war against the commies in Korea or in Vietnam, when it's not so much us, it's the Koreans against the Koreans, or the Vietnamese against the Vietnamese. But it's a proxy war between these two great superpowers. Well, that's what's going on here. It's a mess. And maybe, I don't know, the text doesn't say this explicitly. It only has these two stories in the same place. But maybe that's the thing that woke Jacob up. Maybe Jacob thinking, okay, I got to get out of here. I've had enough of this. And he goes to Laban and he says, look, it's time for me to go. I want to go. What are you going to send me off with? Well, by this time, I've got to imagine that we have here two con men who are dealing with one of the oldest ironclad laws of con men. You have heard it said, and I repeat, you can't con a con. And here are two cons who each know that each of them are a con, trying to figure out how to go and separate. And Jacob wins the battle. And he wins the battle by appealing to Laban's greed. Laban, what are you going to give me? Well, what do you want me to give you? Well, I'll just take these goats and these sheep. There aren't that many of those goats and those sheep. The majority of this flock, the great majority of this flock, matches the description of what Laban is going to get. And not only that, but after the deal is cut, Laban tells his other sons, go on and take the speckled ones and the spotted ones and the striped ones and take them a couple days away from here to forage for the grass. And that's just outright theft. But Jacob's not worried. Now, here's a story we're familiar with, I trust, but that doesn't mean I understand it, where Jacob peels the sticks, and he puts the sticks and the stripes by the watering place where the herds come to feed, and they come together, and somehow this has an impact on what kind of goats and sheep and what color their fur is. I don't know much about modern animal husbandry, much less animal husbandry from thousands of years ago, but it just strikes me as rather odd to think that laying down this kind of stick or that kind of stick is going to have any impact whatsoever on the kind of fur that the animals are going to have. But somehow it happens. I don't know, maybe this is a message from God. Maybe this is sort of the equivalent, the Old Testament equivalent of Jesus spitting in the mud and putting the mud in the blind man's eyes. It's just God wants to work through this kind of means. I don't know. I do know this. It works out for Jacob. And Jacob's plot succeeds. And he is careful to make sure that the healthy cattle in his flock reproduce and the unhealthy cattle in Laban's flock reproduce. He is using his animal husbandry skills to damage Laban, while Laban thinks, and that's the great thing about a good con. I guess the only way you con a con is to convince that con that he's conning you. So Laban's thinking, oh, I'm pulling the wool over the eyes here of Jacob, which is exactly what Jacob wants him to think. Well, it's going to get worse. It's going to get more tense. It's going to get more challenging. What you see here, however, is still more of the repetition of the pattern. Just as we've mentioned that you have the servants being given to Jacob because of some fertility issues with respect to Rachel, just like Sarah and Abraham. Well, like Sarah and Abraham, you have dishonor and disloyalty that is damaging the future of God's people. Remember our principle that it is Moses delivering these stories to the children of Israel as they're on their way to the promised land. So every time you see the damsels in distress, you're seeing a story in which God's going to deliver the people who are hearing the story, looking back in time at their ancestors being rescued and saved. Well, it's going to happen here with Jacob and Laban as well. And just as it happened with Abraham and Pharaoh, and it happened with Isaac and Abimelech, now we have, again, an endangerment to the future generations. But in all three instances, the end result was the patriarch went away far more wealthy than when he had come. So when Pharaoh tries to be with Sarah, he ends up having to give all sorts of wealth to Abraham and enriching him. When Abimelech tries to be with Rebekah, he ends up giving all sorts of things to Isaac, enriching him. And now Laban ends up unintentionally, having been conned, powerfully enriching his son-in-law. Just before chapter 31, which we'll look at next time, just before that chapter begins, the last words we read, the last verse of chapter 30 reads, "Thus the man," that is Jacob, "thus the man increased greatly and had large flocks, female servants and male servants and camels and donkeys." He's been in a bad place. In a manner of speaking, he's been enslaved like the children of Israel. But he's about to go out, and he's about to go out with a bounty. He's about to go out with a bounty on his way to the land that God promised to his grandfather. Do you see the pattern here? Do you see the picture here? This is what they're doing. They were enslaved to Pharaoh, just like Jacob was, in a manner of speaking, enslaved to Laban. And just as Jacob went out with all sorts of wealth, so the children of Israel went out of Egypt with all sorts of wealth, having plundered the Egyptians. Children of Israel went to a place of blessing, and now Jacob is about to flee. This is a type of what was to come, the nation of Israel, the children of Jacob. Jacob himself being renamed Israel. It's the same story being repeated again. Well, when we come together next time, we'll take a look at Genesis chapter 31 and the departure of Laban, his sort of escape from Egypt. And I look forward to joining with you when the time comes.